Bells of Doom from Baffling Mysteries number 10, September 1952. Trapped in a legacy of blood and betrayal. It seemed to George Sanderval that he'd been there before. As he walked down the deserted cobbled street, he was conscious of the sharp staccato sounds the heels of his shoes made on the stones. They were the only sounds in the eerie silence. On either side of the street were small gabled houses that seemed to tilt drunkenly against each other for support. They were all shuttered and silent. There was no light from any of them, and there seemed no sign of life. And yet, all along the way there were street lamps lit by candles that flickered smokily in the damp, fog-ridden night. Somehow George Sanderval knew that they were lit to guide him, and some definite purpose seemed to be guiding him along. It seemed to him that he had come here many times, and each night he had followed this twisting, turning street a little farther along the way. As he moved his hand, his fingers brushed against the sword that hung in its scabbard at his side. His hand curved around the hilt of the sword, and he was filled with a killing rage. As he passed under one street lamp, his silhouette was reflected on the wet cobblestones, and he stopped a moment to examine it. He stared fixedly at the outline of himself, at the tight-fitting jacket, the ruffled cuffs, and the tri-cornered hat upon his head, its long curling ostrich plume waving gently with his movements. I must be dreaming, he puzzled. He was being carried forward to act almost mechanically, as though this had all been arranged beforehand, and there was no need for him to think or make decisions. It must be a dream, he thought. Dimly it seemed to him he could remember living in a way vastly different from the one he found himself in now. He, George Sanderval, was someone who owned a car and lived in an apartment with his wife Jeanette and rode the subways to work every day. He hesitated, trying to pierce the fabric of his dreams. Then all his doubts were gone, as there came a sound he seemed to have been waiting for. There was the clop, clop, clop of horses' hoofs being driven at full speed. Then down the street, past George Sanderval, came tearing the coach and four. The coachman was flaying the backs of the straining white horses. The coach was painted a shining onyx black, and it rocked precariously from one side of the narrow street to the other as it shuttled forward. As the coach drew even with him, for one fraction of a second he caught a glimpse of the couple in it. He knew the woman. She was beautiful, her gold hair piled on her head, the diamonds that ornamented her ears and throat blazing in the lamplight. Their eyes met as the coach fled past, and terror twisted her face. She turned frightened to her companion, who yelled out to the coachman, "Faster, man! Get us away quickly!" Quick battering rage coursed through George Sanderval as he saw the couple, and he yelled, "Hold on there! Wait!" But with a fearful glance around him, the coachman only wielded the whip more mercilessly on the horses' backs, and the carriage disappeared into the distance. George Sanderval stood where the coach had left him. He tried to control the courtling rage that filled him. He did not even try to puzzle out why he felt this way. All he knew was that those in the coach had betrayed him. Now he had to have his revenge. He started walking again, slowly, and he knew he was going to seek them out. He twisted through one narrow, winding street into another. They were all very much alike, silent and deserted. As he passed through each one, he knew that he had come that way before, and yet he never knew what the next street would be like until he came to it. Suddenly, the last street he walked down ended in a square. Across from the square stood a massive cathedral, and in the center of the square was a water fountain. There was a statue of a boy in the center of the fountain, his hand upraised as if to feel the water splash on his palm, but the fountain was silent, the water long since gone. George Sanderval stood there a moment, looking at the silent scene. There was a thin sliver of light showing from under the great doors of the cathedral. Suddenly, from somewhere in the distance, there started the dull, muted tolling of some church tower bell. George Sanderval waited for it to ring out the hour, but it did not stop. The bell continued pealing slowly and ominously, as if sealing someone's doom. A savage smile set George Sanderval's features. He started across the square, picking his way carefully over the wet cobblestones. In front of the cathedral, he lifted the heavy brass knocker and knocked, demanding entrance. The sound echoed and re-echoed through the dead streets, but no one came to answer him. Impatient now, he took his hand away from his sword and pulled the great doors open. For a moment the tableau inside held him motionless. The cathedral was brightly lighted, as if awaiting some important event to take place. Every empty pew and statue inside were outlined by 1,000 candles that burned on the altars and hung from the chandeliers in the ceiling. And then his searching eyes found them. The coachman was nowhere around, but the girl and man cowered in each other's arms down near the foremost altar. They had seen him enter. Now as he started toward them, rage choking him again, they raised their hands in supplication, begging mercy from him. The knowledge formed clearly in his mind now, as if he'd really known it all along. This was the girl he'd forced into marriage with him, and she had run off with the man she loved. He raced forward, tearing his sword from its scabbard. Light glinted off the shining steel blade as he ran. He wielded it viciously at the cowering man before him. "Sanctuary!" the man screamed. "You cannot kill within the sacred confines of the cathedral." But in spite of the ancient law that claimed protection for anyone who sought refuge in the cathedral, George Sandoval ran his sword through the man. As it thrust home, he gloried in the destruction and death he had wrought. As he turned toward the girl, the tolling bells seemed to get louder, pealing maddeningly through his brain. He could think only of his need for vengeance as he raised the dripping sword and killed her. She fell across his arm as she died. She looked up at him, and he saw her lips form the words, "You shall pay for this, George. Your line shall be cursed, and none shall rest easy until you are brought to justice for this crime." She was limp and dead in his arms. Suddenly he was filled with fear, and he moved to throw her from him. He threw her aside quickly and violently because he couldn't bear her dead weight. George Sandoval opened his eyes suddenly and felt the bed beneath him. In the dark, he heard the warm, comforting hiss of the radiator. With relief, he thought it was only a dream. Jeanette was lying beside him, the weight of her arm thrown across his chest. The room was hot, and he moved to push her arm away from him. But then, in some odd, broken sort of movement, her arm flopped back across him. Somewhere, the back of his brain, a warning ticked again as he tried carefully to remove her weight from him. But her arm, like some avenging pointer, came to rest on him again. Fear was growing in him, and he twisted over suddenly and switched on the night table lamp. It was only then that he became aware of the knife still clenched in his right hand, the sticky odor of death that filled the room. He twisted over Jeanette, knowing what he would find. "My God," he whispered. Jeanette lay, a broken, dead shape, and he knew that he had killed her. "It was a dream," he whispered to himself. "I didn't mean to do it." Frantically, he tried to think. Someone, he considered, might have broken in to burglarize the apartment. Possibly Jeanette had awakened, and the marauder had stabbed her in alarm before she could awaken him, and then had planted the knife in his hand. Yes, that had to be it, he decided, but had to check, to look for some evidence that would prove him right. He turned toward the living room, anxious to look around, and yet fearful that the intruder might have remained. He turned on the light switch and looked around, but there was no one there. Yet something seemed to be changed, and he felt like a stranger entering this room for the first time. Something seemed to be drawing him forward into the room. Then he knew what it was. He walked over to the fireplace and stared up at the portrait hanging above it. The arrogant face of the cavalier stared down at him. It was his ancestor, George Saint-Duval, who had to flee France to escape justice for violating the cathedral with his horrible crime. He died at sea, leaving an infant son to survive. And each member of the line, the family legend said, had died in the prime of manhood, though none had paid the full price for Duval's crime. Jeanette had found the portrait last week in a second-hand art shop, and she'd brought it home. They'd laughed at how much George resembled his ancestor. But tonight, as he stared at the portrait, he felt a strange kinship, as if he were merging with the pictured man. George Sandoval sighed deeply. When he was brought to trial, he knew what his defense would be: temporary insanity. Having the picture had obviously made the ancient legend prey on his mind. He would testify that in his sleep he had unknowingly stabbed his wife. He turned toward the phone to notify the police, and it was then he noticed it, lying on the rug at his feet. It was the broken half of an ostrich plume that he knew came from a tri-cornered hat. As he picked it up and held it in his hand, he heard a church bell start to toil steadily in the distance, slow, muted, dooming, and he knew that he was George Saint-Duval. The end.
The preceding thrilling story has presented for your enjoyment. This classic work is now in the public domain, making it freely available to be shared and appreciated by all. Some elements may appear outdated or insensitive by today's standards, but we present this work in its original form to preserve its historical context and literary significance. Sit back, relax, and indulge in this timeless tale. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share. Every bit helps this channel grow. Thank you.